addicted. 15% of the tens of millions of Americans who use alcohol are addicted. 17% of Americans who use cocaine are addicted. 23% of Americans who use heroin are addicted, and 33% of Americans who use or have ever used tobacco products are addicted to tobacco.
33%.
33%. Now, if you look at then the health consequences of that, 410,000 Americans die every year because of tobacco-related illness, 110,000 from alcohol-related illness, about between 6,000 and 7,000 from illicit drug use, and most of that because of unknown concentration and impurities, which would disappear in a legal environment. There's never been a recorded death from the use of marijuana. So on that, just on the basis of the safety factor alone, you can't make an argument against marijuana. Now people say, well, it's a smoked product, you know, you inhale it. Well, I submit to you that if we're talking about medical marijuana, people who are having pain and suffering, they're using small amounts of this inhaled substance, enough to relieve their pain and suffering. Many of them are end-of-life issues. They have terminal cancer, refractory nausea and vomiting from chemotherapy. It doesn't matter if they're hurting their lungs.
Yeah, and then a lot use vaporizers nowadays also,
Right. Yeah.
which really doesn't cause a problem.
Exactly. So, you know, the arguments against the use of marijuana, particularly in a medical model, just start to fade away. Comparing it to tobacco use is really hard to do. The average person who uses inhaled tobacco smokes between 10 and 30 or 40 cigarettes a day. A medical marijuana user may use 2 or 3 inhaled joints of marijuana per day, perhaps a little more. So the quantity of that use is a lot less. Some people say, well, they inhale deeper, they hold it longer. But a person who's using marijuana truly for relief of nausea, vomiting, pain, muscle spasticity, glaucoma, etc., is really only using a very small amount for a short period of time. They wait till the effect wears off and then they use it again. So,
what do you think is keeping marijuana from being decriminalized here in Indiana? I mean, given the compelling argument for decriminalization.
well, after I had this conversation with Mark Cruzan, I started looking around and talking to other legislators, and Peggy Welch, who's a hard-working legislator from District 60, which includes part of Bloomington, is an oncology nurse, and she's a fine woman and a fine nurse. And I gave her my arguments for medical marijuana, and she said, you know, your arguments are great, and I totally agree with you, and I will have nothing to do with it. They're afraid of it. They think people are going to think they're soft on crime and soft on drugs. I went to my brother-in-law, who's a state legislator in District 91, a guy named Ed Mahern, fine legislator, highly respected guy, and he wields a lot of power in the state legislature. And I said, Ed, what would it take to get a bill through the Indiana legislature for medical marijuana? And he said, well, about 70 new legislators.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think that's pretty telling. I send emails, probably average a legislator a day on medical marijuana and looking at drug use from a public health model rather than from a penal model. And people like what I have to say, they like the idea, but the system kind of keeps them paralyzed. And I think things are going to change. On a federal level, federal law trumps state law with regard to the war on drugs, which is, you know, against the Constitution. 10th Amendment to the Constitution says that, in essence, that rights not specifically granted to the federal government belong to the states. Mm-hmm. And when states, you were going to say something?
No, that's go on, finish what you're saying. And
So states that have medical marijuana laws are not being honored by the federal government. Now, 9 states in the District of Columbia have these laws, And the federal government's trying to use their bully pulpit and the power of the federal government to work against these laws. Well, 3 legislators from the state of California, including 1 Republican, have a bill before Congress right now that would allow a medical necessity defense for people arrested on marijuana violations in states that have a medical marijuana authorization. And so that's a huge step forward. Whether that'll get through this Congress or not is a moot point. But this law has a ton of unintended consequences. For instance, the Higher Education Act number 678 that was taken to Congress by an Indiana congressman named Souder.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
Among other things, says that any person convicted of a drug crime may not receive a loan for college.
Yeah, student aid, right?
Now, let me give you how idiotic this is. About 15 years ago, a young woman named Paula Cooper was 15 years old, went to her neighbor's house, a little old lady, hacked her to death, stole $10 in the lady's car, and was considered one of Indiana's most notorious criminals ever. Was sentenced to death. The death penalty was ruled unconstitutional. She was, her sentence was changed to life in prison without opportunity for parole. Did you know that Paula Cooper is a college graduate?
No.
In jail, she got a college degree from Butler University
Okay.
with your tax dollars. But some kid out on the street, walking down the street with a joint in his pocket or a seed in his pocket, who gets busted, can't get a loan that he's got to pay back.
That's terrible. That's terrible. And that's still
This
in
isn't-
effect, right? That law?
They're pursuing it ever more vigorous. 643,000 arrests last year in America for marijuana violations alone. That's like arresting everybody in Wyoming and Montana and putting them in jail. Everybody in 2 whole states. It's insane. I mean, where does it stop? The other thing that happens with this is that this whole effort falls disproportionately on people of color and disadvantage. African Americans make up 13% of the population and are roughly 13% of drug users, but yet are 39% of the people arrested for drug crime and are 59% of the people in jail for drug law violations. This is Jim Crow all over.
Mm-hmm. Sure seems like it.
It is. And, you know, I'm promoting medical marijuana, but you can't promote it in a vacuum necessarily, and I can't not talk about how we got here and how we can get out of this mess. But if all we do is just a little tiny step forward instead of a bunch of steps backwards. For the first time in Indiana state legislative history in a really long time, 2 weeks ago, the Courts and Criminal Code Committee actually decreased a penalty for a drug law violation for paraphernalia possession.
Here in Indiana?
In the state of Indiana, yeah. They actually refused to increase and actually voted to decrease a penalty. First time in a really, really long time. And the only reason I know that is because the guy that I ran against for the state legislature and I have a dialogue, and he mentioned this to me. Because he sits on the
Rare event.
Courts and Criminal Codes Committee. Very rare event. We've got a long ways to go, but I think that with a little support from the Indiana State Medical Association, which I'm promoting, we can go to the legislator and say, you know, we got some people out there that are suffering, that really don't deserve to be persecuted, prosecuted, and incarcerated because they want to feel better and they're sick.
Absolutely.
Now, most people are sympathetic to that idea. 80% of Americans, as I mentioned, feel that people who need marijuana should be able to get it without committing